My name is Iris Campbell. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life I've been described with words that sound kind, but carry a quiet dismissal. Soft-spoken, practical, steady, easy to overlook. I work in a role that keeps things running smoothly behind the scenes. I'm the person people trust with responsibility, but rarely ask about feelings. The one who listens more than she speaks. The one who doesn't make trouble. If you met me in passing, you might assume my life has been small, orderly, uncomplicated. You might think I've never disrupted a room or forced a difficult conversation. People often mistake my calm for passivity, my silence for consent, my patience for lack of depth. I've learned that underestimation can be a very comfortable place for others, and a very dangerous one for the person being underestimated. I'm not here to tell you a story about rage or revenge. I'm not here to perform pain or exaggerate villainy. What I'm about to share is something I lived through quietly, step by step, without dramatic confrontations or raised voices. It's a story about trust, erasure, and the moment when love is redefined by betrayal so complete that it forces a permanent boundary. This is the story of how I cut ties with my mother after I learned she sold my newborn baby to a wealthy family. I didn't discover this truth in a courtroom or through a shocking confession scene. There was no dramatic reveal, no cinematic collapse. I learned it late, when my child was already gone. Money had been exchanged, papers had been signed, decisions had been made about my body, my child, and my motherhood without my consent. By the time I understood what had happened, the world had already adjusted to a reality where I no longer existed as a mother at all. What follows is not a straight line from innocence to strength. It's a slow unraveling, a series of small dismissals that didn't seem important at the time. A role I was quietly assigned and trained to accept. A long stretch of silence that looked like compliance, but slowly became something else. Clarity. This story moves through grief, yes, but also through observation. Through the discipline of not reacting. Through the strange power that comes from seeing people clearly when they believe you are too gentle to notice what they're doing. I'm telling this now not to punish anyone, and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because there are forms of harm that leave no bruises, no police reports, no public outrage, only paperwork, assumptions, and the quiet expectation that you will accept what has been decided for you. As you listen, I don't need you to take sides. I only ask this. Have you ever realized, too late, that someone you trusted had already decided your life for you? For a long time, I didn't think of myself as someone with a role. I thought roles were obvious things, titles, labels, the kind of identities you announce out loud. Daughter, mother, professional, problematic, reliable. I didn't realize that the most powerful roles are often assigned quietly, reinforced gently, and never spoken about directly. To my family, I was the easy one. I was the daughter who didn't rebel loudly, the one who adapted, the one who could be trusted to understand when plans changed, when boundaries blurred, when expectations quietly expanded without discussion. I was praised for being mature at an age when maturity really meant self-erasure. If something hurt me, I learned to translate that pain into patience. If something felt wrong, I told myself it was probably just my sensitivity. My mother liked to tell people how close we were. She would say we had a special bond, that I trusted her completely. And I did, at least in the way a child trusts the person who raised her, the person who taught her what love was supposed to look like. I mistook familiarity for safety. I mistook history for loyalty. To others, I appeared invisible in the best possible way. Dependable, low maintenance, not someone who needed much. When decisions were made in family conversations, they often happened around me, not with me. Someone would summarize afterward, usually ending with, "You're okay with that, right?" And I would nod, because disagreeing felt heavier than accepting. I didn't see this as a problem. I saw it as being good, being reasonable, being someone people could count on. Even when I became pregnant, that perception didn't change. If anything, it solidified. My pregnancy was treated as something happening near the family, rather than within it. People spoke about logistics before emotions, about what would be practical, about what made sense. I noticed that questions about what I wanted were asked less often than statements about what would be best. Still, I didn't push back. I told myself that everyone was just trying to help, that my calm nature invited efficiency. That being easy didn't mean being erased. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see then. When people are used to you absorbing discomfort without complaint, they start to confuse your silence with permission. They begin to believe that your life is flexible material, something that can be reshaped for convenience. I was trusted with tasks, but not with authority over my own experience. I was included in conversations only after conclusions had already been drawn. I was praised for not being emotional during moments that should have broken me, and because I didn't demand space, no one thought to offer it. There's a particular loneliness in being surrounded by people who think they know you, while never actually asking who you are. I didn't feel unloved. I felt assumed, like a known quantity, like someone whose reactions were predictable enough to plan around. And so I learned how to disappear without leaving the room. I learned how to listen more carefully than I speak, how to remember details others dismissed, how to notice patterns without naming them. I became very good at watching, at filing away moments that didn't quite fit but weren't dramatic enough to question. At the time, I thought this was survival. I thought this was maturity. I didn't know it was training, because when people believe you will always be okay, they stop asking whether you are. And when they stop asking, they start deciding, quietly, confidently, without imagining that you might ever say no. That was who I was to them. The daughter who would understand, the woman who wouldn't cause trouble, the presence that made difficult choices feel easier because someone else would absorb the consequences. I didn't know yet how much had already been decided on my behalf. I only knew that my voice had grown very small in rooms where my life was being discussed, and I told myself that was normal. The first moment didn't arrive with warning or weight. That's the thing about real turning points. They almost never announce themselves. They slip into your life dressed like nothing, quiet enough to be dismissed, gentle enough to excuse. I was still pregnant then. Not far along, but far enough that my body had begun to feel like shared property. My mother came with me to an appointment because she insisted. She said it would be easier that way. She always framed her involvement as relief, never as control. In the waiting room, she answered questions that weren't directed at her. When the nurse asked how I was feeling, my mother said, "She's doing fine. She doesn't complain much." I smiled because correcting her felt unnecessary. It felt small, and small things, I believed, weren't worth friction. Later, as we were leaving, she commented casually, almost thoughtfully, about how overwhelming motherhood could be, about how some women weren't ready, about how there were options that didn't involve struggle. She spoke in abstractions, never in specifics. It sounded like concern. It sounded like wisdom. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't yet understand what she was testing. That night, I replayed the conversation and felt a mild discomfort I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It was the feeling of being gently pushed a step backward while being told it was for my own good. I told myself I was being hormonal. That's what my mother was just talking about. The next small cut came when she began speaking to others about my pregnancy as if it were a problem to be solved rather than a life unfolding. I overheard her once on the phone saying, "We're figuring out what's best." We, not me. When I mentioned it later lightly, she laughed. "You're too sensitive. I just meant as a family." That phrase, "too sensitive," has a way of shrinking a person from the inside. It turns a valid instinct into a flaw. I accepted the correction. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to seem ungrateful. So I adjusted. I began sharing less. I stopped correcting her language. I let her sit in the front seat of conversations that should have belonged to me. Each time, I told myself it was temporary, that once the baby arrived, everything would naturally fall into place. What I didn't see was that every unchallenged moment was data. Every silence was confirmation. The story being written about me was becoming clearer to everyone but me. To them, I was overwhelmed but unaware, capable but uncertain, loving but malleable, someone who could be guided. The cut was small, almost invisible, but it was precise. And like all precise cuts, it healed wrong because I never acknowledged it had happened. Once the first boundary dissolves, the next ones don't need force. They just need consistency. What followed wasn't cruelty, it was repetition, a steady rhythm of being talked over, reinterpreted, softened, and reframed. Each instance on its own was reasonable. Collectively, they formed something else entirely. My mother began speaking for me as if it were helpful. When relatives asked how I was coping, she answered before I could. When concerns were raised, she minimized them with a practiced calm. She worries too much, but she'll be fine. She told stories about me that positioned her as the translator of my inner world, the authority on my limits. I noticed that when I spoke with certainty, the room grew uncomfortable. Not hostile, just tense, as if I had broken an unspoken agreement. When I expressed confidence about becoming a mother, my words were met with silence or quick subject changes. When I expressed doubt, those moments were remembered, repeated, and expanded. So I learned to choose my words carefully. I learned which parts of myself were welcome and which ones created resistance. I told myself this was diplomacy. Those families required compromise. Inside, something shifted. I began editing my own instincts before they reached my mouth. I began trusting my mother's interpretation of my emotions more than my own. When she said I was overwhelmed, I looked for proof. When she said I was unsure, I questioned my certainty. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through aggression, but through authority wrapped in care. Everyone else followed her lead, not maliciously. They deferred because she sounded confident, because she had experience, because I didn't contradict her. And I didn't, because contradicting her would have meant asserting something I hadn't yet learned to defend. My own reality. There were moments when I felt a quiet alarm go off inside me. A sentence that didn't feel right. A decision that felt premature. But each time, I explained it away. I told myself that discomfort was part of growth, that trust meant letting go. I didn't know yet that I was being slowly displaced from the center of my own life. By the time I noticed how much ground I had lost, it felt too late to reclaim it without causing damage. And I had been trained to avoid damage at all costs, so I stayed quiet. Roles don't arrive with contracts. They arrive with expectations that feel too subtle to refuse and too heavy to escape. By the time I understood what was happening, the role had already been written for me. I was expected to be grateful. Grateful for guidance. Grateful for the intervention. Grateful for decisions made in my best interest. Gratitude became the price of belonging. I was the reliable one, the woman who didn't fall apart, didn't raise her voice, didn't complicate things with emotion. The assumption was that I could handle more because I always had. And because I handled more was given to me without discussion. My mother slipped naturally into the position of manager. She scheduled appointments, made calls, and gathered information. People praised her for being proactive, for stepping up, for supporting me. No one asked whether I wanted that kind of support. It was assumed. And I played my part well. I showed up on time. I answered questions politely. I listened. I didn't contradict. When decisions were described to me rather than discussed with me, I nodded. I was told how lucky I was to have someone so involved, so invested. The truth is, I didn't feel lucky. I felt distant. From my own experience, from my pregnancy, from my voice. But the distance is quiet. It doesn't alarm anyone. I began to notice how often people described me using the same words: calm, practical, low drama. Those words followed me like a shadow. They sounded flattering, but they also explained away my absence from decision-making. If I were calm, I wouldn't need to be consulted. If I were practical, I would understand sacrifices. If I were low drama, I wouldn't object. It was a role that required me to be endlessly accommodating and eternally secondary. What unsettled me most wasn't my mother's certainty. It was how comfortable everyone else was with it. How quickly they accepted her authority over something that belonged to me. How rarely they looked to me for confirmation. I realized then that my invisibility wasn't accidental. It was functional. The role I was assigned allowed other people to feel efficient, moral, and decisive. It allowed them to believe they were helping without ever sitting with my fear or confusion. It allowed them to move forward without resistance. And I let it happen, because resistance would have required something I didn't yet have: the willingness to disrupt the narrative that had been built around me. So I stayed inside the role. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, I would step back into the center of my life. I didn't know yet that the role I was playing was designed to end with my quiet disappearance. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where I finally said enough. If you were watching from the outside, you wouldn't have seen anything change at all. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was sitting alone in my car after an appointment, one I hadn't scheduled myself, but had been told to attend. The engine was off, the parking lot was quiet. I remember noticing how still everything felt, like the world had paused without telling me. I placed one hand on my stomach out of habit. It was an instinctive gesture, something grounding, and for the first time in months, a thought surfaced that didn't immediately get edited or softened. This is mine. Not the situation, not the opinions around it, not the logistics being discussed in other rooms. The child! The sentence landed without emotion at first. No panic, no anger, just clarity. Clean and sharp. It startled me because it didn't ask permission to exist. It didn't negotiate. It simply stated a truth I had been dancing around. I realized then how far I had drifted from my own center. Up until that moment, I had been orienting myself around everyone else's comfort, measuring my responses, anticipating reactions, avoiding friction. I had been performing so convincingly that I had forgotten it was a performance. Sitting there, I didn't suddenly become brave. I didn't plan anything. I didn't even feel ready to act. But something internal realigned. I began to replay conversations differently, not to judge them, but to hear them. I noticed how often my feelings were summarized instead of explored. How frequently were they framed as foregone conclusions? How rarely I was asked direct questions about my desires. I understood then that my silence hadn't protected me. It had positioned me, and that positioning had consequences. That afternoon, I didn't confront my mother. I didn't cancel appointments or make declarations. I went home. I cooked dinner. I responded normally when she asked how my day went. But inside, I stopped explaining things away. I stopped telling myself that discomfort meant immaturity. I stopped assuming that authority equaled care. I stopped mistaking calm surroundings for safety. The shift was quiet, but it was irreversible. From that moment on, I began listening not to what people said, but to what their words did, what they enabled, what they erased, what they assumed would never be challenged. I didn't yet know how much damage had already been done. I didn't know how little time I had. But I knew one thing with a certainty that didn't waver. Whatever happened next, I would no longer pretend that my absence was the same thing as agreement. That was the day something shifted. After that day in this parking lot, my silence stopped being something that happened to me. It became something I chose, carefully, deliberately, and with a level of awareness I had never used before. From the outside, nothing shifted in a way anyone could point to. I didn't suddenly assert myself. I didn't draw new boundaries out loud. I didn't change my tone, posture, or vocabulary. If anything, I became even easier to be around, more agreeable, more contained. But internally, everything had changed. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a learned response, a way of smoothing tension before it fully forms. I had been quiet because speaking felt risky, disruptive, and selfish. Silence was how I maintained peace, other people's peace. Now silence had a different weight. I stopped offering my thoughts preemptively. I stopped filling pauses. I stopped clarifying myself in advance so others wouldn't misunderstand me. I realized how often I had been working to make sure everyone else felt comfortable while my own uncertainty went unattended. When my mother spoke for me, I no longer felt the immediate urge to step in or soften her words. Instead, I listened closely. Not to what she said, but to how she framed me. I noticed the patterns in her language, how she emphasized my fragility when it served her narrative, how she downplayed my certainty when it complicated things. She often said things like, "I know her better than she knows herself," or "She trusts me to handle this." And I let those statements hang in the air without confirmation or denial. Not because I agreed, but I wanted to see how far that assumption traveled on its own. People rarely question authority when it sounds calm and confident. They especially don't question it when the supposed subject of that authority remains quiet. My silence acted like validation. It allowed others to relax into decisions they didn't want to wrestle with morally. I began to see something unsettling. My quiet made their choices easier. And that realization changed how I used it. I started listening with intention. I tracked how often decisions were framed as already made. How often do conversations begin with conclusions instead of questions? I noticed who deferred to whom and under what circumstances. I noticed how quickly my presence was reduced to a reference point rather than a voice. I didn't interrupt those moments. I observed them. There's a difference between being silent because you feel small and being silent because you're collecting information. I crossed that line without announcing it. My mother became more confident as my resistance failed to appear. She expanded her role naturally, almost seamlessly. She made calls. She spoke to professionals. She relayed information to me secondhand, summarizing instead of sharing details. She told people I was relieved to have her handling things. And I let her, because pushing back too early would have alerted her to something she wasn't supposed to see yet, that I was no longer operating from trust. I realized something else during this period, something uncomfortable but crucial. Confrontation, when you are still unclear, often benefits the person who already holds power. They have rehearsed their justification. They have allies. They know which levers to pull. Silence, when paired with clarity, can be disarming. So I waited. I began replaying past conversations with new ears. Things I had brushed off as concern now sounded like positioning. Comments that once felt benign revealed an underlying certainty that my choices were provisional, subject to revision by someone else. I didn't spiral. I didn't collapse into panic. I felt oddly calm, almost detached. That calm wasn't numbness, it was a focus. I began to recognize how systems, not emotions, were doing most of the damage. Paperwork, processes, assumptions embedded into the procedure. I noticed how easily my consent was implied without ever being explicitly requested. How my compliance was presumed because I hadn't objected loudly enough. And I understood, finally, that my silence had been doing two different jobs at two different times. Before, it had protected others from discomfort. Now it was protecting me from interference. Others mistook this for weakness. They mistook my lack of visible reaction for agreement. They believed I was still pliable, still overwhelmed, still grateful to be guided. That misinterpretation allowed them to continue exactly as they were, which meant they showed me everything. They showed me how decisions moved through rooms I wasn't invited into, how narratives were shaped before reaching me, how certainty grew stronger the less I spoke. I didn't need to ask questions. The answers were volunteering themselves. I remember thinking, more than once, how strange it was that no one seemed curious about my quiet. No one checked in to see if it meant something different than before. They were so accustomed to my compliance that they never considered I might be withdrawing strategically. Silence, when expected, becomes invisible. And invisibility can be useful. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting anything dramatic. I was simply allowing the truth to reveal itself fully without my presence altering its behavior. I was learning who felt entitled to decide my life, who benefited from my passivity, who relied on my assumed consent. By choosing not to react, I let their confidence grow unchecked. And confidence makes people careless. They say more, they explain less, they stop hiding. That was when I understood something that still stays with me. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is not to announce that you've changed, because the moment you do, the environment adjusts. I stayed quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally listening. What they never noticed was not some sudden intelligence on my part or a hidden talent finally activated. It was something far simpler and far more dangerous for them. They never noticed that I had stopped needing reassurance. Once you no longer require validation from the people who underestimate you, you become difficult to predict. And predictability had been their greatest comfort with me. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I still showed up when expected. I still responded politely. I still let information reach me secondhand. But underneath that surface, I had begun a different kind of work. Quiet, methodical, invisible. I started with memory. I realized how much I had been relying on feelings before, on vague discomfort, on emotional impressions that were easy to dismiss. Now I treated everything like data. I replayed conversations and isolated facts from tone. I paid attention to timelines. I noticed inconsistencies in how things were explained to me versus how they were described to others. I remembered dates especially. When suggestions first appeared, when language shifted from maybe to probably to this is what we're doing. I noticed how often my mother spoke as though agreement had already occurred, even when no conversation had taken place. Then I began documenting. Not dramatically, not obsessively, just enough. I saved messages instead of deleting them. I took screenshots of emails I hadn't been included in, but later heard referenced. I wrote brief notes to myself after conversations, not interpretations, just wording, exact phrases. Who was present? Who nodded? Who stayed silent? It felt strange at first, like I was betraying the version of myself who believed love didn't require evidence. But clarity requires a record, and I was done relying on memory alone. What they never noticed was how much access they gave me because they believed I wasn't paying attention. My mother spoke freely around me. She summarized conversations she assumed I didn't need full context for. She explained decisions as if they were inevitable outcomes of my own limitations. And because I didn't object, she grew more comfortable filling in gaps with her own authority. She underestimated my ability to understand systems. She thought my quiet meant I didn't grasp complexity. In reality, my work life had trained me to navigate procedures, to read between lines, to understand how outcomes are shaped long before anyone calls them decisions. I started learning, not about people, but about processes. I familiarized myself with terminology that had previously washed over me. I noticed which forms mattered and which ones were symbolic. I learned how consent could be implied, assumed, or retroactively justified. I learned how easily someone else's confidence could substitute for my presence. No one noticed because I didn't ask for help. Asking would have revealed intent. Instead, I observed. I listened when professionals spoke, even when they weren't speaking to me directly. I paid attention to how often my mother was treated as the primary point of contact and how rarely anyone verified that arrangement. What they never noticed was the moment my fear turned into focus. Fear scatters attention, focus gathers it. I stopped wondering whether I was overreacting. I stopped asking myself if I was being unfair. Those questions had kept me suspended in self-doubt. Now I asked different ones. What is actually happening? Who is empowered by this structure? What assumptions are being made because no one has challenged them? I didn't confront anyone with these questions. I let them sit quietly in my mind, while the answers revealed themselves through behavior. There were moments when my mother corrected me in front of others, subtly, politely. She would reframe something I said, adjust my tone, and clarify my intentions for me, and I let her. Each correction showed me exactly how she positioned herself in relation to me. They never noticed that I stopped internalizing those corrections. Instead of shrinking, I catalogued them. Instead of defending myself, I learned how the narrative about me was being maintained. I learned who benefited from seeing me as unsure, overwhelmed, and pliable. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience refined into precision. I wasn't planning an escape. I wasn't plotting exposure. I wasn't waiting for the perfect moment to speak. I was positioning myself to understand the full shape of what had already been done. Because you can't respond effectively to harm you don't yet fully see. And while they continued confidently, believing the story they had built about me, I was quietly assembling something else entirely. Not power, not revenge, not confrontation. Clarity. That was what they never noticed growing inside me. The truth didn't arrive all at once. There was no single document, no dramatic sentence that changed everything in an instant. It came together the way real truths usually do, slowly, reluctantly, piece by piece, until denying it required more effort than accepting it. By the time I understood what I was looking at, I already knew what it meant. The first clue was procedural, not emotional, a detail that didn't line up, a reference to a process I hadn't participated in, but was spoken about as complete. When I asked a neutral question, carefully, casually, I was given an answer that assumed knowledge I didn't have. That assumption stayed with me. I followed it quietly. I traced where it led. I listened to how often people spoke in the past tense about something that was still, in my mind, unresolved. I noticed how confidently timelines were discussed without my involvement. And then, without intending to, I found myself standing in the space between what I had been told and what had actually occurred. There had been meetings I wasn't part of. Conversations are summarized but never shared. Decisions framed as support that functioned as a substitution. Somewhere along the way, my presence had become optional. The private reveal wasn't a shock. It was a confirmation. Money had been discussed before my consent was ever sought. Not hypothetically, specifically. Arrangements had been explored under the assumption that my hesitation equaled incapacity, that my silence meant I would eventually agree, that my motherhood was provisional, subject to approval. The realization settled in my body like cold water. There was grief, yes, but it didn't come first. What came first was clarity so sharp it almost felt like relief. because suddenly nothing felt confusing anymore. The dismissals, the urgency, the way others spoke around me instead of to me, it all aligned. I learned that papers had been prepared while I was being reassured. Those signatures were discussed in rooms I never entered. That my role had been reduced to a technicality, a box to be checked, a delay to be managed. By the time I fully understood, the exchange had already occurred. Money had changed hands. Legal language had been activated. My child was no longer where I believed they were. There was no celebration in this discovery, no breakdown, no dramatic collapse, just a quiet, devastating understanding. My motherhood had been erased administratively, not emotionally, and the person who facilitated it, the person who spoke for me, reassured others on my behalf, and translated my silence into consent was my mother. I didn't confront her, not then. Confrontation would have been premature. Emotion would have muddied the clarity I had just gained. I needed to see the full architecture of what had happened before I responded to it. So I sat with the truth alone. I let myself feel the weight of it, without rushing to act. I let the shock move through me, without demanding resolution. I understood that whatever I did next would be permanent. Not because of anger, but because some betrayals collapse the relationship they come from. This was one of them. In that private space, with no witnesses and no audience, I made no vows and no threats. I didn't imagine justice or closure. I simply acknowledged reality. What had been taken from me could not be undone by conversation. What had been decided without me could not be softened by explanation. And the relationship I thought I had with my mother no longer existed, not because she had made a mistake, but because she had made a choice. That was the private reveal. Not loud, not dramatic, just final. After the truth fully settled, time behaved strangely. Days passed, but nothing moved. The world continued as if no line had been crossed, as if nothing irreversible had already happened. That suspension was almost more unbearable than the shock. It was the space where options still appeared open, even though I could feel, deeply, that most of them were illusions. This was the decision point. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just heavy. I didn't rush it. I couldn't afford to. I laid out every possible path in my mind and examined them one by one, not emotionally, but structurally. I asked myself what each option would require from me and what it would cost. The first option was confrontation. It was the most obvious one and the one everyone expects. Confront your mother, demand answers, demand remorse, force the truth into the open and make her look at what she had done. But when I imagined it honestly, not as catharsis, but as reality, I saw something very clear. She would not experience that confrontation as accountability. She would experience it as a conflict to be managed. She would explain. She would justify. She would reframe. She would speak calmly about intentions and sacrifice and difficult choices. She would acknowledge my pain in carefully measured language, just enough to position herself as reasonable and loving. And in that conversation, I would once again be asked to understand. I knew that script. I had lived inside it my entire life. Confrontation would not return my child. It would not restore my agency. It would only reopen a dynamic where my pain became something she interpreted rather than owned. The second option was exposure. I could tell the extended family. I could dismantle the narrative she had built by introducing facts into rooms where assumptions had lived comfortably. I could force acknowledgement through shock. But exposure has a cost that isn't talked about enough. It turns your trauma into a public object, something debated, something weighed, something people form opinions about. It invites commentary, doubt, and well-meaning questions that still require you to explain yourself. And I understood something crucial. I did not want my motherhood to become a discussion topic. I did not want my loss to be validated only if others agreed it was severe enough. I didn't want witnesses. I wanted sovereignty. The third option was reconciliation. This was the most seductive one because it carried the promise of normalcy, of continuity, of not having to grieve two losses instead of one. Reconciliation would have required me to accept that what happened was a mistake rather than a decision, that love had simply gone too far, that the outcome mattered less than the intention. But reconciliation requires shared reality, and our realities no longer overlapped. She believed she had acted decisively, wisely, even heroically. I understood that she had erased me from my own life without consent. There is no middle ground between those two positions. Reconciliation would have required me to accept a version of events where my autonomy was optional. That was not a price I could pay and still remain myself. Then there was the final option, the one I avoided looking at for as long as possible. Silence. Not temporary distance, not a cooling off space, not a pause. Silence as a permanent boundary. It terrified me because it offered no closure in the theatre. No final conversation, no emotional release, no moment where everything was said and understood. It meant walking away without explanation. It meant allowing her to sit with unanswered questions. It meant accepting that some people would never know the full truth and that I would never correct them. That option felt cold at first, almost cruel, but when I examined it honestly, I realized something unsettling and liberating. Silence was the only choice that did not require my continued participation in my own erasure. Speaking would have invited a response. Silence would deny access. Speaking would have centered her reaction. Silence would center my boundary. This decision was not about punishment. It was about geometry, about removing myself from a structure that only functioned if I stayed inside it. I asked myself one final question, and I did not allow myself to soften it. If I remain in contact, even to explain, what am I teaching her about the limits of my body, my life, and my authority? The answer was unbearable, so I chose the option that did not ask me to be generous, patient, or understanding. I chose the option that did not require permission. I chose absence. I did not announce it. I did not justify it. I did not threaten it. I simply stopped showing up. Some decisions don't feel powerful when you make them. They feel hollow. They feel like grief layered on top of grief. They feel like stepping into a quiet that has no witnesses and no applause. But I understood this with certainty. If I stayed, I would continue negotiating my right to exist. If I left, I would lose a mother, but I would keep myself. That was the irreversible choice. And once it was made, there was nothing left to explain. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel relief. I felt something closer to stillness. Not peace yet, stillness, the kind that comes after you stop arguing with yourself. I didn't cut contact in a dramatic way. There was no final message, no declaration, no list of grievances sent at midnight. I simply stopped participating. I stopped responding. I stopped making myself available for interpretation, explanation, or reconciliation. From the outside, it probably looked like withdrawal due to grief. That assumption worked in my favor. While nothing appeared to be happening, a great deal was. I began moving quietly, not emotionally. I understood that emotion would cloud judgment, and judgment was the only thing I had full control over. So I treated my life the way I had learned to treat systems at work, carefully, sequentially, without announcing transitions until they were complete. I changed practical things first. Contact information, access points, small administrative details that signaled separation without inviting confrontation. I redirected communication channels so nothing reached me unexpectedly. I created distance that didn't need explanation because it didn't ask for permission. Then I focused on documentation. I gathered everything I already had and organized it chronologically. Messages, notes, records of conversations, not to use them immediately, just to know exactly what existed. To understand the scope of what had happened without relying on memory or emotion. This wasn't preparation for a fight. It was preparation for autonomy. I consulted professionals quietly, not to make accusations, but to understand realities. What could be undone? What could not? What was fixed in place regardless of intent? I asked factual questions and listened to factual answers. Some doors were already closed. I didn't push against them. I needed to know where the walls were before deciding how to live inside the space that remained. Throughout all of this, no one seemed alarmed. My absence was noticed only as an inconvenience, a delay, a phase. People assumed I would return once things settled. My mother, I later learned, told others I needed space, that I trusted her to handle things in the meantime. She mistook my silence for consent continuing indefinitely. That misunderstanding allowed me to move without resistance. I didn't correct narratives. I didn't interrupt assumptions. I let the version of me they were comfortable with remain intact because it kept them from looking too closely at what I was doing. Moving in silence requires discipline. There were moments when I wanted to speak, not to argue, but to assert reality. But I understood that the assertion would trigger a response, and the response would complicate everything. So I held the line. I built a life that did not include them in its foundation. I rearranged routines. I established new rhythms that didn't leave space for interruption. I practiced not explaining myself, even internally. The strangest part was how invisible this movement was to everyone else. They believed power required noise, conflict, emotion. They didn't recognize quiet finality when it passed right through their field of vision. By the time they began to feel something missing, the structure had already changed. And when people finally noticed that I was no longer where they expected me to be, they assumed it was temporary. They assumed wrong. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived with an absence. At first, it was subtle. Missed responses, delayed replies that never came, plans that quietly dissolved because I wasn't there to hold them together. The systems I had once maintained without recognition began to falter, not dramatically, but noticeably. People don't realize how much labor you contribute when you do it without complaint. They only realize it when it's gone. My mother was the first to feel it, though she didn't understand it yet. She reached out casually at first. Neutral messages, practical questions, the kind that assume continuity. When those went unanswered, her tone shifted slightly. Not to panic, to confusion. She was used to access. When days turned into weeks, the language changed again. Concern entered the conversation, not about me, but about the disruption. She asked if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. Each message framed the situation as temporary, as if time alone would return me to my place. I didn't respond. Without my presence, small fractures appeared in the narrative she had been maintaining. People asked questions she hadn't prepared for. Details she once glossed over needed explanation. Without me there to silently validate her version of events, her authority began to feel less stable. Not wrong, just unsupported. Others felt it too. The extended family noticed gaps. Information didn't flow as smoothly. Emotional labor went unabsorbed. The role I had played, reliable, quiet, endlessly accommodating, was suddenly vacant. They didn't know how to replace it. What surprised me was how quickly irritation followed concern. My absence created inconvenience. It required adjustments. It forced people to sit with responsibilities they had grown used to delegating to my patients. That irritation was revealing. It showed me that what I had offered was never truly appreciated. It was expected. My mother began to push gently against the silence. She left longer messages. She tried warmth. She tried reason. She reminded me of our history, of sacrifices, of closeness. She did not apologize, not once, and that told me everything I needed to know. As weeks passed, the discomfort deepened into unease. People sensed that something had shifted permanently, even if they couldn't articulate it. My absence was no longer a phase, it was a condition. And conditions change behavior. My mother started to lose control of the story, not publicly, but privately. Without my presence to anchor her authority, she had to work harder to maintain it. She repeated herself more often. She over-explained. She began framing my silence as emotional instability rather than a boundary. I let that narrative exist, because narratives collapse under their own weight when they are unsupported by reality. The consequences were not explosive. They were slow, erosive. Each unanswered message widened the gap between assumption and truth. Each day I stayed silent reinforced that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision. And as that reality settled in, something shifted on the other side of the silence, the understanding that whatever power they thought they held over me no longer functioned. They were beginning to feel the loss, even if they didn't yet understand what they had lost. There is a moment when people realize a situation has crossed from uncomfortable into unrecoverable. It doesn't arrive with certainty at first. It creeps in slowly, disguised as urgency, then regret, then panic. That moment came for them long after it had come for me. At first, my silence had been interpreted as grief, then as distance, then as stubbornness. Each interpretation allowed hope to survive, that eventually I would respond, that a conversation could still happen, that something could be repaired if handled correctly. But repair requires access, and I had removed it. The messages shifted again. The language lost its casual tone and took on a careful softness. My mother began referencing mistakes. Not specifics, never specifics, but vague acknowledgements that things hadn't gone the way anyone intended. She spoke about how complicated everything had been, how much pressure she had been under, how she had only wanted to protect me. Still, there was no apology that acknowledged the harm, because naming it would have required acknowledging my authority over what had been taken from me. As weeks turned into months, urgency replaced confidence. She reached out through others, asked relatives to check on me, to remind me of family, to tell me she was worried, not accountable. The panic showed itself in the inconsistency. One day, she was conciliatory, the next indignant. One message spoke of love, the next of obligation. She oscillated between tenderness and entitlement, unsure which would reopen the door. Neither did. What she couldn't accept was that this wasn't a conflict waiting to be resolved. It was a boundary already in place. People often believe that time fixes things. What time actually does is clarify them. It removes the illusion that urgency creates. It reveals whether remorse deepens or simply repeats itself with different wording. In my mother's case, repetition replaced reflection. She wanted absolution without surrendering control. She wanted reassurance without accountability. She wanted me back in my role. Not because she missed me, but because the system she had built worked better when I was inside it. That system had already failed. The extended family began to sense it too. The tone of their messages changed. They stopped encouraging me to talk it out and started asking what had happened. Carefully, cautiously, as if they already knew the answer might be something they didn't want to hear. I didn't explain, not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because an explanation would have pulled me back into a narrative that wasn't mine to manage anymore. There is a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing you no longer have leverage. That realization doesn't inspire humility, it inspires desperation. My mother reached that stage quietly. No outbursts, no dramatic pleas, just an increasing insistence that we needed to clear the air, as if the problem were misunderstanding rather than violation. But it was already too late to fix it, because what had been broken wasn't communication, it was trust. And trust doesn't return because someone finally feels uncomfortable enough to want it back. By the time she understood that I was not coming back, not to argue, not to forgive, not to explain, the relationship she believed we still had was already gone. Not destroyed in anger, just closed. Permanently. The confrontation did happen, not the way people imagine it. No raised voices, no accusations stacked like weapons, no dramatic collapse into tears. It happened quietly, almost clinically, long after emotions had burned themselves out on the other side. It wasn't planned, I didn't initiate it. She did. By the time my mother finally understood that silence was not a phase, she adjusted her approach. She stopped trying to reach me through others. She stopped sending messages that assumed intimacy. Instead, she asked, carefully, if we could meet, just once, to clear things up. I considered ignoring it, but something in the wording told me this wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about containment. About closing a loop, she could no longer control it from a distance. I agreed. We met in a neutral place, public, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of space where emotion feels inappropriate by default. That was intentional on my part. When I saw her, I felt no surge of anger, no fear, just distance. The kind that comes from having already mourned someone before they leave the room. She looked older, not fragile, just unsettled. People who are used to authority don't age well when it stops working. She began speaking immediately. She talked about misunderstandings, about pressure, about how complicated everything had been. She said she had always acted out of love, that she had believed she was doing what was best for everyone. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct her timeline. I didn't challenge her framing. I let her finish, because what I needed wasn't explanation, it was confirmation. And she confirmed everything. When she finally paused, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for emotion, waiting for a reaction, waiting for permission to continue believing this was a conversation. It wasn't, I told her calmly, that I wasn't there to debate intent, that I understood perfectly what she believed she had done, that I also understood what she had actually done. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't list evidence, I didn't ask questions. I told her one thing, that she had made a decision about my life and my body without my consent. That, regardless of justification, that choice ended our relationship. Not temporarily, not conditionally, ended. She tried to speak again, to explain further, to soften it. I stopped her, not sharply, just clearly. I told her this conversation wasn't about forgiveness, that forgiveness requires accountability, and accountability requires ownership. I told her I was no longer available for reinterpretation of my experience. There was no heat in my voice, no shaking, no tears. That absence unsettled her more than anger ever could. Because anger invites defense, calm invites reality. She asked what she could do to fix it. I told her nothing, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because some things cannot be repaired by effort, only prevented by restraint. And restraint had not been exercised when it mattered. We left separately. There was no hug, no closure ritual, no promise to talk again. Just an understanding. Clear, final, unambiguous. The confrontation didn't give me relief. It gave me confirmation, and that was enough. People often expect transformation to look dramatic, louder, sharper, as if reclaiming yourself requires a visible edge. It doesn't. What changed me wasn't confrontation or closure. It was alignment. I no longer live in negotiation with myself. For a long time, I thought strength would feel like certainty, like confidence that never wavered, like answers that arrived fully formed. Instead, strength arrived as consistency, as the quiet refusal to abandon myself for the comfort of others. I am not hardened. I am not bitter. I am not fueled by resentment. I am clear. My life now is smaller in some ways, and infinitely larger in others. Fewer relationships, fewer explanations, fewer roles I didn't choose, but the ones that remain are real. They don't require translation. They don't depend on my silence to function. I trust my instincts again. Not because they're always perfect, but because they belong to me. I no longer outsource my reality to people who benefit from reshaping it. When something feels wrong, I don't immediately search for a way to justify it. I listen. That alone has changed everything. I've learned that boundaries don't need to be loud to be firm. They don't need witnesses to be valid. The most durable ones are often invisible to everyone except the person who set them. I don't explain my absence anymore. I don't correct assumptions. I let people believe what they need to believe because my life is no longer built around being understood. It's built around being intact. There are moments when grief still surfaces, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present. It lives quietly alongside everything else. I don't fight it. I don't dramatize it. I let it exist without giving it the authority to define me. I am not the person I was to them. I am not the easy one, not the flexible one, not the silent absorber of consequence. I am someone who understands that love without consent is not love, that family without respect is just proximity, that loyalty to others should never require betrayal of self. And perhaps most importantly, I am someone who no longer mistakes endurance for virtue. The version of me that survived that erasure did not do so by becoming harder. She did so by becoming precise. That is who I am now. There's a strange expectation placed on stories like mine. People want an ending that balances the loss. They want justice to feel symmetrical. They want restoration, or reunion, or at least a clear villain who pays an obvious price. Something that makes the pain feel justified in retrospect. But real life doesn't work that way. What happened to me didn't end with victory. It ended with clarity. And clarity, while quieter, is often more honest than resolution. I didn't get my child back. I didn't get an apology that named the truth. I didn't get public acknowledgement or collective outrage. What I got was something smaller and far more permanent. I got my authority back. I learned, in the most painful way possible, that harm doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from certainty, from someone believing they know what's best for you so completely that your consent becomes irrelevant. I also learned that silence is not inherently weakness, but unchosen silence is. When silence is forced on you, it erases you. When silence is chosen, it protects you. The difference is everything. Cutting ties with my mother wasn't an act of punishment. It was an act of refusal, a refusal to continue participating in a relationship that required my disappearance to remain comfortable, a refusal to accept love that arrived only after my autonomy had been removed. Some people will hear this story and think I'm unforgiving. Others will think I'm cold. But forgiveness that costs you your selfhood isn't forgiveness, it's compliance. And love that requires erasure isn't love, it's control dressed in familiarity. If there's a moral here, it's not about parents or betrayal, or even motherhood alone. It's this. No one, no matter how close, how well-intentioned, how trusted, gets to decide your life without your consent and still expect access to you afterward. Not everyone who harms you will see themselves as harmful. Not everyone who crosses a line will acknowledge it when you name it. And sometimes the most honest response isn't confrontation or explanation, but withdrawal. Quiet, clean, final. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been the one who was easy, understanding, low maintenance, the one people made decisions around instead of with, know this. Your silence was never proof that you didn't matter. It was proof that others relied on you, not realizing how much you did. And the moment you do realize it, everything changes. I don't know what healing looks like for everyone. I only know what it looked like for me. Choosing myself without asking permission and accepting that some doors close not because you're cruel, but because you're done disappearing. So I'll leave you with this question, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to walk away quietly, not because you didn't care, but because staying would have meant losing yourself?
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.